You probably pay taxes to the government. Maybe it is taken from your salary, added to something you buy, or paid in another way. Today, paying taxes is such a normal part of life that most of us rarely stop and think about where the whole idea actually came from. But have you ever wondered how the very first tax system began? Who decided that people should give a portion of what they earned or produced to support a larger society? And perhaps the most interesting question of all, what did people use to pay taxes before money even existed? To find the answer, we have to travel back thousands of years to a time when there were no banks, no paper bills, no credit cards, and no modern governments. Money as we know it today simply did not exist, but humans were already building something new. They were settling down, growing crops, raising animals, and creating permanent communities. For thousands of years, many people lived by hunting and gathering. But as agriculture developed, human societies began to change. People learned to grow crops such as wheat and barley and began keeping animals. Instead of constantly moving from one place to another, communities could settle in one area and produce food year after year. And once people began producing more food than they needed immediately, something very important happened. There was now a surplus. A family might grow more grain than it could eat at once. That extra food could be stored, exchanged, or given to someone else. And as communities became larger, this surplus became one of the most valuable resources in society. Small settlements gradually grew into larger villages, and some villages eventually became cities. One of the most important regions in this transformation was ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Some of the world's earliest cities and organized states developed there. But building a city was not easy. Someone had to maintain irrigation canals that brought water to the fields. Workers had to construct buildings and walls. Soldiers needed food and supplies. Temples required resources. Officials had to organize everything. A growing society needed people to perform different jobs, and those people still had to eat. Today, governments can collect money and use it to pay for services and projects. But ancient societies didn't have modern money systems, so they needed another way to collect the resources necessary to keep their communities running. And this is where the early history of taxation begins to become fascinating. Instead of asking people for money, authorities could collect a portion of what people already produced. Imagine an ancient farmer standing beside a field of wheat or barley after harvest. His family might need some of that grain to survive, but there could be more than they needed immediately. A portion could be collected by the temple, palace, ruler, or another authority and stored for later use. So, if you're wondering what the earliest taxes looked like, the answer probably wasn't a pile of coins. It was much more practical. It could be grain. It could be oil. It could be animals. It could be food or other useful goods. In a society where agriculture was the foundation of the economy, these things were wealth. If you controlled the grain, you controlled one of the most important resources people needed to survive. And this also explains why early taxation was so closely connected to farming. A farmer didn't necessarily have money to give, but he had a harvest. That harvest could be measured, collected, stored, and redistributed. Of course, not everyone in an ancient society was a farmer. Some people were builders, craftsmen, soldiers, laborers, or officials. So what could someone give if they didn't have enough agricultural products? Sometimes, the answer was their labor. A person could be required to work for a certain period of time on a large public project. They might dig irrigation canals, carry materials, build walls, construct buildings, or help with other work needed by the community or the authorities. Think about how different this was from paying taxes today. You might simply transfer money from your bank account, but thousands of years ago, your contribution could mean spending days or even longer performing physical work. In some societies, this kind of required labor became an important way of supporting the state. But once authorities began collecting grain, animals, goods, and labor from large numbers of people, another problem appeared. Someone had to keep track of everything. Imagine hundreds or thousands of farmers bringing grain into a city. How would officials know who had already contributed? How much did each person provide? How much was stored? How much was distributed to workers or soldiers? This need for accounting became one of the reasons writing and record-keeping became so important in early civilizations. Ancient Mesopotamia gives us remarkable evidence of this. Scribes used pieces of wet clay and a reed-like stylus to record economic and administrative information. They could record quantities of grain, animals, goods, workers, deliveries, and other resources. After the clay dried, those records could survive for thousands of years. And this is one of the amazing things about ancient history. When we look at a clay tablet today, we're not just looking at an old piece of clay. We may be looking at evidence of how an ancient society actually functioned. It shows us that collecting resources was not simply about taking whatever a ruler wanted. It required organization. There had to be people who measured things, people who recorded them, people who stored them, and people who decided where those resources would go. In many early societies, temples and palaces became important centers of this economic organization. Agricultural products could be collected and stored, and then redistributed to workers, soldiers, officials, or others connected to these institutions. This created a system that was very different from the modern economy, but the basic principle may sound surprisingly familiar. People produced resources. Authorities collected a portion. Those resources were then used to support the larger organization. And as civilizations became more powerful, these systems became more sophisticated. Ancient Egypt developed its own complex system of collecting resources. The Nile River supported large-scale agriculture, and agricultural production became extremely important to the Egyptian state. Again, the key point is that wealth did not necessarily mean money. A field full of grain could represent enormous wealth. A herd of animals could represent wealth. Stored food could represent wealth. And human labor itself could represent wealth. So when we ask what the first taxes were, we have to be careful not to imagine a modern tax system appearing overnight. There wasn't one single day when someone invented taxation and suddenly everyone started paying it. Instead, different forms of required contributions developed gradually as human societies became larger, more organized, and more unequal in power. And these contributions were not always exactly the same thing we would call a tax today. Some were payments to rulers or states. Others could be offerings to temples, required labor, or tribute paid by one group to another. But over time, systems for collecting resources became an important part of organized government. Then something else began to change the story: money. As trade expanded, societies developed different forms of money and eventually widespread coinage. Coins made it much easier to measure and transport value. Imagine trying to move thousands of kilograms of grain from one place to another. That's difficult. Now imagine being able to represent a large amount of value using a much smaller quantity of metal. That made trade easier. It made payments easier. And eventually, it also made taxation easier in many societies. But even after coins became common, taxes were not immediately paid entirely in money everywhere. Different societies continued to use combinations of money, goods, and labor for long periods. The transition was gradual. As governments became larger, taxation also became more complicated. Taxes could be connected to land, agricultural production, trade, property, or specific goods. Governments needed officials to collect them and records to keep track of them. And this is where taxation became more than simply collecting food. It became part of a growing administrative system. A government needed to know who owned land, who produced crops, who owed something, how much had been collected, and where those resources had gone. In many ways, the development of taxation and the development of bureaucracy went hand in hand. But there is another side to this story that is just as important. Taxation was not always fair. For an ordinary farmer, giving away part of a harvest could be a serious burden. Losing grain meant having less food available for the family. Being required to work on a government project meant losing time that could have been spent farming or earning a living. And because ancient rulers often had enormous political and military power, people did not always have the freedom to simply say no. At the same time, the resources collected could also support things that benefited entire communities, such as irrigation systems, defensive walls, public buildings, food storage, and organized administration. So early taxation was complicated. It could help a society grow. It could help governments organize huge projects, but it could also strengthen the power of rulers and place heavy demands on ordinary people. And that tension has existed for thousands of years. Today, the way we pay taxes looks completely different. You might earn money through a job, have taxes deducted automatically, or pay them online with a few taps on your phone. You don't need to carry sacks of grain to a government warehouse. You don't need to bring sheep to an official. And you certainly don't have to spend the day digging an irrigation canal just because you've been asked to contribute. But the basic idea has a surprisingly ancient history. Long before banks, paper money, digital payments, and modern governments, people were already contributing a portion of their resources to support larger organized societies. Sometimes that contribution was grain. Sometimes it was oil. Sometimes it was animals or other goods. And sometimes it was their own labor. So, the next time you pay your taxes, take a moment to think about how old this idea really is. Because the story of taxation did not begin with money. It began in a much simpler world. A world of farmers, fields, harvests, animals, labor, and growing communities. And somewhere along that long journey from the first agricultural settlements to the modern world, the simple idea of giving a portion of what you produce became one of the most important systems in human civilization.